Chapter 2, 115. Mrs. Samur, did you see a teenage boy? He's wearing an old coat. One of the men who dashed into the carriage asked the conductor fiercely. Klein glanced at the man through the corner of his eyes. He was thin and hardy, his skin a dark shade from prolonged exposure to the sun. His eyes were much more recessed than the typical lone kingdom citizen, a Highlander or a mixed blood. He nodded thoughtfully in the middle of the northern continent. The point where the Hornus mountain range began, there was a highland which was extremely hot and dry. Most of it belonged under the Fat Potter Kingdom, while the area west belonged to the Inus Republic. The area to the east belonged to the Lone Kingdom. Its natives were thin and barbarians, but they were brave and skillful in warfare. A long time ago, they posed as one of the biggest problems for the three nations, but with the advancement of gunpowder and the changes in the way war was carried out, these Highlanders eventually recognized reality and submitted. A large number of them left the Highlands and entered Backland Trar Fip Potter City and the various flourishing cities or ports in the northern continent. Some were workers, while others became grunts of the local triads they dared to kill and showed no fear of thorny situations. The conductor was a man in his 20s. He shrank back when he heard that. As he pointed in the direction of the third-class carriage, I saw him. He went that way. The leader, wearing a black coat and half-top hat, nodded discernibly. He led his men and rushed to the third-class carriage and showed no concern towards the surrounding passengers. If I were that boy, I would have already all lighted from the third-class carriage. As Klein read his newspaper, he began letting his thoughts stray. About a minute later, the train whistled as the carriage doors closed. Chug, chug, chug. The steam metro began speeding up as it cruised along. But at that moment, Klein suddenly sensed something, as he looked up to see the door leading to the other second-class carriages. The teenage boy walked slowly into the carriage wearing his old coat and round-top hat while carrying a raged hare's sack. He looked adolescent and had refined facial features. His red eyes were staid and solemn, impressive. He alighted from the third-class carriage and circled around to enter from the first-class carriage again. Was he afraid that his pursuers had partners waiting inside the metro station? Klein was slightly surprised. He felt that the boy's handling of the situation was rather mature and careful. He was much better than most people in their 20s. He clicked his leftmer lightly and secretly activated his spear vision. He scanned the boy and saw that he was in a state of fatigue. His emotions were tense and he was dispirited. However, he still contained the bless that represented calm thinking. Impressive at this age. Kale mumbled silently as he lowered his head and continued reading his papers. The boy didn't notice that he had been scrutinized by a beyonder as he headed for the third-class carriage. Once again, the rest of the journey happened stably and calmly. Klein arrived 20 minutes later at one of the 3 train stations in Sherwood Borough. He took a rented carriage for nearly 10 minutes before finding Mink Street. According to the descriptions in the papers, he came to Unit 17, which was next to Unit 15, and pulled the doorbell. Cuckoo, cuckoo. As sounds reverberated inside the house, a mechanical bird that didn't look too fancy popped out from above the door. It was about the size of a palm and was made up of gears and other parts. It constantly nodded its head and let out the sound of a cuckoo bird. Not a bad toy. It's just not very well crafted. K made in of objective assessment. Nearly 20 seconds later, the dark door was pulled open. A young maidservant dressed in white and black looked wearily at Klein and asked, "May I help you?" Klein smiled and waved his cane, which was now wrapped with the newspapers. "I'm here to find Mrs. Samur about renting a house." "I'm guessing it hasn't been rented out." The full name on the newspaper was Stellan Samur. "Not at all. Please wait a moment." The maid Sarah bent her back politely. She rushed inside and reported to her mistress. Moments later, she came out again and ushered him in. She then helped him place his cane and luggage in the foyer and hung his coat and hat on a clothes rack. In the same place, a warm blast of air and undated him, dispersing the chill Klein had brought in. He scanned the area and first saw a uniquely designed fireplace. He saw pieces of red, smokeless charcoal burning inside Sam's living room. It was rather big. It was nearly equivalent to the entire Moore's first floor in area. Certain areas were decorated with carpets or oil paintings of beautiful sceneries. The maidservant brought Klein to the sofa and said to her mistress in a pale yellow dress, "Madame, the guest is here." The mistress was in her 30s. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked rather pretty and had preserved her youthfulness well. She held a silver inlaid feathered royal fan in her hand as she was at home, and the fireplace made for a warm environment. She didn't wear anything around her neck, revealing her white bosom and shiny long neck. "Hello there." Mrs. Sammer Klein pressed one palm to his chest and bowed. Mrs. Sammer smiled in a reserved manner. "Good evening. Please have a seat. Do you wish for some coffee or tea?" Klein sat on the sofa and answered, "Frankly, tea please, Julianne Marquis." "Black tea," instructed Mrs. Sammer. She then turned her eyes to Klein and asked, "How might I address you?" "Sherlock Morty, you can call me." Sherlock Klein had long thought of a fake name. At that moment, he caught a whiff of a fragrance from the kitchen and saw complicated pipes. "Those are my husband's designs. Although his actual job is a manager at the company, he's a machinery enthusiast. He's a member of the Kingdom's Suit Reduction Association." Mrs. Sammer noticed Klein's gaze and explained with a smile, "Mrs., there's no need to go into such detail. I'm not here on a blind date with your husband." Klein lampooned, as he said without his smile waning, "Mrs. Sumer, I wish to rent the Unit 15. Mrs. Sumer straightened her back as she sat elegantly. She said with a smile, "I have to remind you of certain things. Unit 15 doesn't have such pipes, reclining chairs, card tables, mahogany kitchen cabinets, fine porcelain silver cutlery, gold-plated tea sets, or removable carpets." She pointed at the things in her house as she introduced them one after another. After she was done, she added, "It originally belonged to my elder sister and brother-in-law, but due to a business failure, my brother-in-law had no choice but to move to the southern continent. They have a plantation at Bam. However, I don't agree with their choice voice. This is just too unfair for my niece and nephew. There are no good grammar schools there, not even a good home tutor, Mrs. That's not something I would like to know." Klein nodded sincerely and said, "Apart from the weather, there's no place in the southern continent that can compare with Backland." His agreement satisfied. A head with beautiful golden hair. The lady didn't raise her head. All she do was point at the wooden board by the side of the window with the prices peak, period, 700 a.m. to 9 a.m., 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., 10-minute, headway 15-minute headway. For all other times, first-class seat 6p, second-class seat 4p, third-class seat 3p. Return trips are respectively 965p annual pass. First class £8, second class £5 10. So third class no annual pass. It's cheaper than I imagined. There's actually no distance restriction. Melissa would definitely love this more than a horse carriage. This is the culmination of machinery, Klein thought. As he suddenly felt upset, he revealed the brilliant smile and fished out 4PE and handed it to the cashier. "Second class seat." Smack, the cashier tore a ticket and stamped it before handing it to Klein after finding the line that led to Sherwood Borough and passing through the not very strict security checks. Klein went down the flight of stairs and quickly came to the platform. He followed out the labels on the ground and found the corresponding location for second-class seats. Choo-choo. He didn't wait long before he heard the chugging sound of the train and the thunderous steam whistle. He saw a huge steam locomotive, its large and meandering body together with its black metallic luster and complex machinery mixed together to form a unique beauty. Backlands. Metro still used steam locomotives. The smoke that they spewed was specially designed to enter a pipe above and travel through a chimney out into the world. This was also the true usage for the lawn and garden out on the streets. Amidst the screeching sound of metal, Cole first waited for the passengers to alight before carrying his cane and luggage over. Slowly, he then allowed the conductor to check his tickets. Unlike the third-class seats, the second-class seats were one person to a seat. So there was no concerns about having one's seat snatched. Just as Klein sat down, stowed away his luggage, and leaned on his cane, he suddenly heard hurried footsteps. He subconsciously looked towards the door and saw a thin, adolescent boy rushed into the carriage. The boy was wearing a coat that didn't suit his age. He wore a rounded top hat and carried a ragged haversack. He kept his head very low. "I'm sorry, I got on the wrong carriage. I'm from third class." He showed his ticket and apologized to the passengers before briskly walking towards the third class. Carriage. Klein retracted his gaze and once again confirmed his destination as he waited for the doors to the carriage to close. At that moment he heard chaotic and hurried footsteps. He then saw a few men dressed in black coats and half-top hats rush into the carriage. Are they chasing us? Of that 15-year-old boy, Klein instinctively had such a thought. He shook his head gently and continued reading his newspapers and map, just like the other passengers on board the carriage. Mrs. Samur greatly, as her eyes darted slightly. This house still has a 3 years lease. I wish for you to pay a year's rent at once 18, so a week the use of the furniture will cost 1 sol. I can collect a deposit of 50. CLE shook his head and smiled. Mrs. Samur, you should be able to tell that I just arrived in Backland. I don't know what will happen to me in time to pay 50 for a deposit. Will lower my ability to resist any risks. My limit is half a year, £25. He still planned on renting another 1-bedroom apartment in Backland's East Borough. He would use it to change his clothes under disguises and shirk off any tailing. It was necessary for what he planned to do. Stalin. Samus nodded slightly and asked, "Have you studied at grammar school?" Klein chuckled and said, "Yes, I later self-studied history." "Do you have any identification with you?" asked Stellan casually. "I'm sorry. I was in a hurry when I left home and forgot to bring it with me. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from Mid-Seashire." Klein deliberately used the accent his classmate Wooch often used when he said forgot. It reminded him of Captain Dunn Smith. The smile on his face turned even more brilliant at this moment. The maidservant Julianne brought a cup of black tea over the cup. Was porcelain white with classic flowery patterns. Some areas were plated in gold. Klein took a sip and found the fragrance distant. The mix of sourness and sweetness were perfect, and it was clearly much better than the side black tea. He often drank very authentic. Marquis black tea he complimented with the description which couldn't be faulted. Mrs. Stalin Samur curled her lips and said, "Then let's do half a year rent. £25. Klein thanked her and engaged in a few minutes of idle chatter with her, until another maidservant found a service contract from the study. After both parties signed the contract, Klein counted £25 while feeling the pinch and pushed it to Mrs. Samur. Stellan counted it silently before smiling. "Mr. Morey, I believe you'll be finding a job in Backland." "Yes," Klein answered, feeling a little lost. The corners of Stell's mouth hooked up. "I can give you some suggestions with a weekly salary lower than 3. It would be difficult for you to live in Sherwood Borough. Your rent, food expenses, water, gas, and charcoal expenses, transport expenses, and everything else added up will cost at least 2 foley. Believe me, this is Buckland. One still has to consider new clothes and good color, and tea sets. A weekly salary of 3 is the bare minimum. If your weekly salary reaches 5, you can hire a lady's maid at 6B, you can consider hiring a chef at 7B, you can add a footman for 8B, you can hire an additional lady's maid. Mrs. Samur, I think you are flaunting your wealth. I once earned more than 10 a week." Klein maintained his smile as he listened attentively. At that moment the door suddenly opened. A stout man walked in. He was dressed in a black, double-breasted suit, and leather gloves of the same color. Above his lips were 2 elegant mustaches. "Luke, this is Mr. Moretti. He will be our neighbor." Stellan Samur went forward and introduced him, obviously the master of the house. Luke took off his coat and handed it to the valet behind him. He smiled politely and said, "Mr. Moriarty, would you like to join us for dinner? This is the manager of some coin company, a member of the Lone Kingdom Suit Reduction Association." Klein said with a smile, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Samur. I've eaten on the steam locomotive, although that taste does leave a deep impression on one." After exchanging some pleasantries, Klein was led by Julianne out of the house and into the neighboring Unit 15. The layout was very familiar to the unit next door. The first floor had a huge living room, a dining room with decent lighting, 2 guest rooms, a bathroom, a cell, and a kitchen that extended all the way back. On the second floor, there were 4 bedrooms, an activity room, a solarium, a study, 2 bedrooms, and a huge balcony. "Mrs. Samur wishes to tell you that you can rent out part of it, but not to workers or make this place too packed or noisy. Oh, I'll bring you clean blankets, sheets, and pillowcases in a while." Julianne returned to the Samurs after informing Klein after doing a round of packing. Klein finally settled into Bakken. He sat in an empty living room and suddenly felt lonely. Hence, he forced himself to consider his future plans, whether he liked it or not. Revenge and advancement couldn't be done in the blink of an eye. Therefore, he had to obtain a lucrative job to prevent himself from facing any financial problems. However, the job couldn't restrict him and affect his movements and plans. In other words, he needed sufficient freedom after some deliberation and eliminating unsuitable jobs. Klein was left with three choices. He could become an author by becoming a plagiarist. However, his identity was sensitive, so the more famous he became, the more trouble it meant. All he could do was give up unwillingly. The second choice was to be a news reporter. This was considered quite a decent job in this time and age. However, job applications required his educational certificates and other documents. Kent was helpless in that respect. Finally, he chose the third job, private detective. This was also the reason why he had taken on a fake name.